I know. Bob Dylan said it so calmly that Dean Martin froze mid-sentence. Vegas, 1966, backstage at the Sands. Dean Martin, the smoothest crooner in America, half of the legendary Rat Pack, the man with the golden voice, had just told this 25-year-old kid wearing a leather jacket and sunglasses indoors that he couldn't sing. "Kid, I've heard your records. You can't even sing in tune." And Dylan had just said, "I know." Dean stared at him. "You know?" "Yeah." "You know you can't sing, and you're still making records?" Dylan's face showed no emotion, no shame, no defense, just calm. That's the point. Those 3 words, "that's the point," would haunt Dean Martin for the rest of his life. Because Bob Dylan wasn't embarrassed that he couldn't sing like Dean Martin. He was proud of it. And in that moment, backstage in Vegas in 1966, Dean Martin realized something terrifying. The world he'd spent 40 years perfecting was about to be replaced by someone who didn't care about perfection. But what Dylan said next, the 5 words that made Dean storm off in fury, would echo through music history for the next 60 years. Because it wasn't just about singing in tune, it was about whether craft mattered anymore, whether the old rules meant anything, whether Dean Martin's entire career had just become irrelevant. If stories about 2 legends clashing over the future of music move you, subscribe right now and drop a comment. Does technical skill matter, or is honesty more important? Because what Dean Martin and Bob Dylan argued about in 1966 is still being argued today. Let's go back. To understand what happened, you need to understand where they were. Las Vegas, the Sands Hotel and Casino. Dean Martin was at the absolute peak of his powers, 50 years old, headlining every night, selling out shows. The Rat Pack was the most famous group in entertainment. Dean had spent 40 years perfecting his craft: vocal training, breath control, perfect pitch, smooth delivery. He made it look effortless, but it wasn't. It was the result of decades of work. And then there was Bob Dylan, 25 years old, just gone electric at Newport Folk Festival. Folk purists had booed him, called him Judas, said he'd betrayed the movement. Now he was touring, playing rock and roll, getting booed every night, and Dean Martin had heard the records. Rough voice, nasal, out of tune, no vibrato, no control. To Dean, it was everything music shouldn't be. So when he saw Dylan backstage, both performing at the Sands that week, different nights, Dean couldn't help himself. He'd had a few drinks, enough to be honest, not enough to be sloppy. And he walked up to Dylan. "Kid, I've heard your records." Dylan looked up, didn't take off his sunglasses. "Yeah? You can't even sing in tune." The hallway went quiet. A few stagehands stopped. Other performers turned to watch. This was Dean Martin. You didn't challenge Dean Martin, especially not in Vegas, especially not at the Sands. But Dylan didn't flinch. "I know." Dean blinked. "You know?" "Yeah." "You know you can't sing, and you're still making records? That's the point." Dean's face changed. Confusion first, then something else. Anger, maybe, or fear. "What do you mean, that's the point?" Dylan's voice was flat. "Singing in tune is what you do. I do something else." "What? Ruining music?" "No, freeing it." Dean laughed. But it wasn't a real laugh. It was defensive. "Freeing it from what?" "From people who think there's only one way to sing." Now Dean was getting angry. There is only one way, the right way, with skill, with craft, with training. Dylan didn't raise his voice. "And how many Dean Martins can there be?" Dean stopped. "What?" "You perfected that sound, the smooth crooning, the perfect pitch. Made it so good nobody can do it better." Dean's voice rose. "Damn right I did. But now there's nowhere to go. You perfected it. So what's left? Either copy you or do something else." I'm not saying it's your fault. I'm saying it's inevitable. You showed music what it could be. I'm showing it what else it could be. Dean's face was red now. By singing out of tune? By not caring about tune, by caring about something else. Like what? And here's where Dylan said the 5 words, the ones that made Dean storm off, the ones that echoed for 60 years. Dylan took off his sunglasses, looked Dean Martin in the eye, and said, "Honesty over perfection always." Dean Martin stood there for a moment, just stared at Dylan. Then he shook his head. "You're wrong. You're completely wrong. And in 20 years, nobody will remember your name." He turned and walked away, down the hallway, past the stagehands, past the other performers, everyone watching. And Bob Dylan put his sunglasses back on, picked up his guitar case, and left. They never spoke again. For 29 years, they existed in the same music industry, crossed paths occasionally, award shows, industry events, never acknowledged each other. Dean continued his career, still perfect, still smooth, still technically flawless. Dylan continued his, still changing, still refusing to sing properly, still being called everything from genius to fraud. But something had shifted that night in Vegas. Dean knew it, even if he wouldn't admit it, because Dylan was right about one thing. Perfection had become a cage. Dean Martin could only be Dean Martin, smooth, perfect, safe. But Dylan could be anything, and was. In interviews over the years, Dean was occasionally asked about Dylan. His answer was always some version of the same thing. He can't sing, not really. But the kids seemed to like him. It was dismissive. But there was something else underneath, something Dean never said out loud. Fear. Because Dean Martin had spent 40 years being the best at what he did. And Bob Dylan had walked in and said, "What you're the best at doesn't matter anymore." December 1995, Dean Martin died, heart failure. Age 78. The funeral was old Hollywood, Frank Sinatra, Shirley MacLaine, the remaining Rat Pack. And in the back, a delivery arrived. White roses, expensive. The card said, "You were right about one thing. I can't sing like you. But that was never the goal. Rest easy, Dino." Bob. Dean's daughter read it, didn't understand. Nobody at the funeral understood. Because nobody knew about 1966, about the confrontation, about honesty over perfection. The card was filed away with other condolences, and the story stayed buried. Until 2004, Rolling Stone interview, Bob Dylan, 63 years old. The interviewer asked about the old guard, Sinatra, Dean, Bing Crosby. "Did you ever meet Dean Martin?" Dylan paused. "Once, 1966, Vegas." "What happened?" "He told me I couldn't sing." "How did you respond?" "I told him I knew, that it was the point." "What did he say to that?" "He didn't understand, told me I was wrong, told me I'd be forgotten in 20 years. And here you are, almost 40 years later." "Yeah. Do you think Dean was wrong?" Dylan thought for a long time. "Dean wasn't wrong about me not being able to sing like him. He was right. I can't. But he was wrong about whether that mattered. See, Dean thought music was about craft, about perfection, about doing it the right way. And I thought music was about honesty, about meaning something, about connecting with people who felt like outsiders. Dean's music was for people who had it together. Mine was for people who didn't. Both matter, but he couldn't see that. He could only see his way." The interviewer pressed further. "Did you ever regret what you said to him about perfection?" "No." "Not even when he died?" "Especially not when he died. Because Dean died thinking I'd destroyed music. And I didn't destroy it. I just opened a door he didn't want to walk through." "Do you wish you'd reconciled?" "We couldn't reconcile, because we weren't just two people disagreeing. We were two eras, and his era was ending." "That sounds harsh." "It's honest." 2015. Bob Dylan releases an album of standards, songs from the Great American Songbook, the kind of songs Dean Martin sang. Critics are confused. Why is Dylan singing these songs now? In an interview, Dylan explains, I spent my whole life running from what Dean Martin represented, perfection, craft, the old way. But I'm 74 now, and I realize Dean was right about one thing. Craft matters, not the way he thought, not as the only thing, but it matters. These albums are me admitting Dean knew something I didn't when I was 25. He knew that lasting requires craft, even if honesty is what breaks through first. I broke through with honesty, but I've lasted because I learned craft. Dean had craft from the beginning, but he never learned to be messy, to be honest, to break his own rules. We both needed what the other had, and neither of us would admit it. In 1966, Dean Martin told Bob Dylan he couldn't sing. Dylan said, "That's the point." Dean said craft mattered. Dylan said honesty mattered more. They were both right, and both wrong. Dean Martin died in 1995, thinking Bob Dylan had ruined music. Bob Dylan lived long enough to realize Dean Martin had understood something important about music. The argument they had in 1966, perfection versus honesty, craft versus meaning, is still being argued in every genre, every generation, every artist who has to choose. Do you perfect the craft, or do you break the rules? Do you sing in tune, or do you sing the truth? Dean Martin chose perfection and created beauty. Bob Dylan chose honesty and created change. Music needed both. But in 1966 in Vegas, backstage at the Sands, neither man could see that. Dean walked away thinking Dylan was ruining everything. Dylan stayed thinking Dean was irrelevant. And it took 50 years for Dylan to say what he should have said in 1966. Dean, you were right. Craft matters, but so does breaking it.